Now that you have a basic idea of what a counterplan is and some of the basic parts of a counterplan, I'd like to take just a few minutes to talk to you about the different types of arguments that you're going to want to make on the affirmative in the instance that the negative reads a counterplan against you. These arguments, in fact, there are 5 different types of arguments, are arguments that you can make against any counterplan, even if you aren't prepared against it specifically. Some of them are easier to make, some of them are a little bit more complicated, and in some of the future videos, we'll also look at some of the ways that some of these answers can be answered back. But for the most part, I would like you to try to remember an acrostic. C-spot. C-S-P-O-T. C-spot. And that stands for Contradictions, Solvency, Permutation, Offense, Theory. That's Contradictions, Solvencies, Permutation, Offense, Theory. And these 5 arguments, if you'll think about how the counterplan works, should give you things that you can say, even if you've not prepared specific arguments against a counterplan. With that said, we're going to break down each one of those 5 components and talk about how you can use them with your plan against some different types of counterplans. The first thing is the C, or the contradictions. This is something that you'll never be able to directly prepare ahead of time, but you should definitely point out in the context of the debate round. For example, oftentimes teams will read arguments what they call conditionally. This means that they would say, yeah, it's okay if a counterplan contradicts another argument later down the road, because we can always get rid of the counterplan. We can always pretend like the counterplan isn't a good idea. But one thing the affirmative should say is, look, there are times that the counterplan itself contradicts what they're trying to say. For example, if the negative reads a counterplan saying they solve your problem better than you do, and then reads an argument on your case saying that solving the problem would be bad, then you definitely want to point that out. For example, if your affirmative is about reducing climate change, and the negative says, counterplan, do something other than the plan because it would reduce climate change even more, then they might initially be thinking, look, we'll beat them because the counterplan solves better. But a lot of times teams will also make arguments on case about climate change. They might say climate change is good, that it reduces the chance of an ice age, or they might say that climate change can be adapted to, or that climate change, the way that we do it currently, actually helps out plants. All of those are fine arguments, but if they make arguments that contradict, you want to pay attention to that, and then be able to articulate how the counterplan and the other arguments contradict with each other. The second set of arguments you can have evidence on oftentimes. These are solvency arguments. These are reasons why your plan is better than the counterplan, or why the counterplan doesn't solve your affirmative. A lot of times you're going to be looking for evidence that talks about why your specific plan is the only way that we can solve the problem. Things like specific expertise or knowledge, or the ability of the agency that you're using to have done it for a long time, etc. All of those are reasons why the plan solves better than the counterplan. Also, if it's a counterplan that you have heard before, one of the things that you want to do is go back and research it and see if there's specific reasons why the counterplan wouldn't fix the problem. For example, last year, the team that I was coaching had a plan that had Cyber Command, which is a military cyber organization, do some things. And one of the common counterplans was to have the Department of Homeland Security do it instead. We were able to find evidence that said that the Department of Homeland Security isn't very effective at those specific things. And so by having that evidence, we were able to say, look, your counterplan doesn't solve as well. The third type of argument is the one that is probably the most common and easiest to make argument, and that's a permutation. A permutation says that we should do all of the plan and all or part of the counterplan. It proves that there is no trade-off between doing the plan and doing the other action. In other words, it's not part of cost-benefit analysis. It's not a reason to reject doing the affirmative. A couple of common permutations that you will want to make against almost every counterplan would say things like perm do both. You might say do the entirety of the plan and do the entirety of the counterplan. You might explain how that would even solve the problem better. For example, if your plan is to have the federal government increase funding for STEM education, and the counterplan has state governments increase funding for STEM education, you might say, look, schools need money. Having the federal government do it and state governments do it is even better. Sometimes you'll have very specific permutations based on evidence about how different organizations can cooperate together or why that would be a net beneficial thing. And so when that happens, you could also include reasons like that the cooperation between the affirmative and the negative through the permutation of perm cooperate and do both would actually be net beneficial. The fourth type of argument, the O, stands for offense. These are reasons why the counterplan is net worse. These might be disadvantages to doing the counterplan, or just things that the negative hasn't thought through. For example, in the example that I was talking about earlier about Cyber Command and the Department of Homeland Security, we had evidence that talked about how if the Department of Homeland Security got involved in cyber operations, that would trade off with their ability to protect the ports around the United States, which is a really bad thing for the economy. And so by reading that disadvantage against the counterplan, we said, look, that doesn't happen with the affirmative, and this is a new advantage to just doing the affirmative. Finally, the T stands for theory. Theory arguments are those arguments that you're going to want to say that the counterplan itself is illegitimate. You might say the counterplan is topical, and that's problematic because it proves the resolution is true. You might say the counterplan is bad because it uses an international agent, or that it is what is called a plane-inclusive counterplan or a PIC. You might say that it's bad because it is conditional or dispositional. These are all theory arguments that are later explained in other arguments, but in other videos, but I want to make sure that you think through that theory is always part of answering a counterplan as well. So just to recap, we've talked about how you want to argue that they contradict each other. There are problems with solvency, that you offer a permutation or multiple permutations, that you talk about offense, and that you talk about theory. That should set you up well to debate on the affirmative whenever you hit a counterplan.